The world is still. Imagine, if you will, a time before the ticking of clocks, before the rush of cities, and before the heavy weight of history had even begun to settle upon the earth. We find ourselves in the high, thin air of a winter long ago, nestled within the cradling peaks of the Pindus Mountains. Outside the heavy timber doors of our sanctuary, the snow falls in thick, silent flakes, each one a unique crystalline geometry, descending through the indigo twilight with a lightness that defies gravity. There is no wind here, only the soft, rhythmic sound of the snowfall, a gentle hush that blankets the jagged edges of the world until everything is rounded, soft, and white. In this ancient, quiet place we are safe. We are tucked away in a room constructed of thick gray limestone and seasoned cedar beams. The scent of the room is a tapestry of comfort. The sharp, resinous tang of dried pine needles, the deep, earthy musk of wool rugs, and the faint, sweet aroma of beeswax candles flickering low in their bronze holders. A fire burns in the hearth, not a roaring, congealed mass of flame, but a steady, hypnotic pulse of amber embers. Occasionally, a single spark will pop, a tiny, muffled sound like a dry twig snapping underfoot, and a ribbon of gray-blue smoke will curl lazily up the chimney, vanishing into the cold night sky. Tonight, we do not speak of the wars of the gods or the tragedies of heroes. We speak of the slow, monotonous unfolding of the cosmos, the way a weaver might patiently pass a shuttle through a loom back and forth, hour after hour until a tapestry is born. To understand the Greek world, one must first understand the silence from which it emerged. Before there was Zeus, before there was the sun or the moon, there was only the void, chaos. But this was not a chaos of noise or confusion. It was a chaos of stillness. It was a vast, cool, velvet darkness like the space between stars. It was a space of infinite potential, waiting, breathing, as calm as a frozen lake beneath a winter moon. Imagine that darkness now. It is a soft darkness, one that does not press against you but rather supports you like deep, still water. There is no light to strain the eyes, no sound to prick the ears. There is only the sensation of being. Within this void, the first elements began to stir, but they stirred with the slowness of glaciers. Gaia, the earth, did not burst into existence. She thickened. She coalesced like cream rising to the top of a bowl of milk. She was the first solid thing, a heavy, grounding presence in the dark. Think of the texture of the earth in the deep of winter. Beneath the layers of frost and snow, the soil is dense and cold, a rich dark brown that smells of damp stone and ancient roots. Gaia was this density. She was the foundation. We can imagine her as the very floor beneath our feet, the steady, unmoving weight of the mountain. Above her, the sky, Uranus, began to form, a vast, sapphire dome that mirrored the stillness of the earth below. There was no friction between them, only a long, eternal gaze. In our small, warm room, we might imagine the first mountains rising from Gaia's surface. They did not erupt with fire. They grew with the patience of stalactites in a cave. Inch by inch, the stone pushed upward, grain by grain, crystal by crystal. The limestone was gray and smooth. The granite was speckled with mica that caught the dim, primordial light. We can almost feel the texture of that stone under our fingertips, cold, unyielding, but strangely comforting in its permanence. The mountains were the world's first architecture, tall and silent, wearing caps of clouds like soft woolen hats. The air in those early days was thick and sweet, undisturbed by the breath of any living creature. It was a world of pure logistics, of physical constants finding their places. The seas, the Pontus, did not crash against the shore with violence. Instead, they ebbed and flowed with the rhythmic consistency of a heartbeat. The water was clear and heavy, like liquid glass, sliding over the smooth pebbles of the first beaches. Each pebble was rounded by the water's patient touch, a process that took eons. A slow, monotonous grinding of stone against stone, polishing them into perfect, cool spheres of gray, white, and ochre. As we sit by the fire, we think of the first gods, the Titans, who were like the great forces of nature themselves. They were not beings of action, but beings of state. Hyperion was the light that filtered through a morning mist, a pale, lemon-colored glow that warmed the skin without dazzling the eyes. Theia was the clarity of the air, the way a distant mountain peak appears sharp and distinct on a crisp winter afternoon. They moved with a deliberateness that is difficult for our modern minds to grasp. Every gesture took a century. Every word was a symphony of low, resonant tones that vibrated in the marrow of the earth. Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory, began the long task of recording the stillness. She did not use a quill or parchment, for such things did not yet exist. Instead, she etched the history of the world into the very structure of things. She etched it into the rings of the ancient cedar trees, which grew with agonizing slowness, adding one thin layer of wood each year. She etched it into the layers of sediment at the bottom of the deep, still lakes. We can imagine the silence of those forests, where the only sound is the occasional thump of a heavy clump of snow falling from a bough to the forest floor. The trees stand like sentinels, their bark rough and furrowed, smelling of damp earth and longevity. In the winter setting of our story, the hearth is the center of all things. Hestia, the firstborn of the great gods, is the personification of this hearth. She is the warmth that seeps into your bones when you come in from the cold. She is the steady flame that never wavers. We can imagine her tending the fire of the world. Her movements are methodical. She takes a heavy iron poker and gently adjusts the logs, ensuring that the air flows just so. She sweeps the hearth clear of excess ash with a small broom made of dried heather. The shush-shush of the broom is a hypnotic sound, a domestic rhythm that has remained unchanged for thousands of years. The ash itself is soft and gray, a fine powder that holds the ghost of the heat. Hestia knows the value of the mundane. She knows that the world is built not on grand gestures, but on the maintenance of the small and the necessary. She ensures the pots are clean, the blankets are folded, and the fire is banked for the night. There is a profound safety in her presence. With Hestia, there is no fear of the dark or the cold. The winter may howl outside the thick stone walls. The frost may patterns across the bronze-framed windows. But inside, there is only the golden light and the steady, boring, beautiful routine of the home. As the ages passed slowly, so slowly, the world began to take on more detail. The rivers began to find their paths, carving narrow, winding channels through the limestone plateaus. The water did not rush, it meandered. It followed the path of least resistance, swirling in gentle eddies around moss-covered rocks. The moss was a deep, vibrant green, even in the heart of winter, a soft carpet that cushioned the edges of the world. If you were to touch it, it would feel damp and springy, a tiny forest of microscopic stems. The logistics of the early universe were handled with a quiet efficiency. The hours were counted by the movement of the stars, which turned in their celestial tracks like the gears of a great, well-oiled machine. There was no friction in the heavens. The planets moved through the ether with a silent, sliding motion. Each star had its assigned place, a tiny point of silver light pinned to the dark. We can imagine the great Titan Atlas, not straining under the weight of the world, but rather holding it with the effortless poise of a master craftsman holding a precious vase. He feels the coolness of the celestial sphere against his palms, the smooth, polished surface of the heavens as they rotate slowly through the night. In this world of Greek myth, even the shadows have a physical presence. They are long and blue in the winter afternoon, stretching across the snow like the fingers of a resting giant. As the sun sinks lower, a pale golden disk that provides light without heat, the shadows deepen, turning from indigo to charcoal. They fill the valleys and the hollows of the mountains, creating a sense of depth and mystery that is entirely peaceful. There is nothing lurking in these shadows. They are simply the world's way of resting its eyes. We think of the first mortals, perhaps, living in simple huts of stone and thatch. Their lives were dictated by the seasons. In the winter, their world shrunk to the size of the hearth. They spent their days in the repetitive tasks of survival, which in their monotony became a form of meditation. They would sit for hours, carding wool, pulling the tangled fibers through metal teeth until they were straight and soft. The scritch-scritch of the carding combs is a soothing, tactile sound. Then they would spin the wool into yarn using a simple drop spindle. The spindle would whirl and hum, a tiny, vibrating top that transformed a cloud of wool into a strong, consistent thread. The yarn would then be woven into heavy cloaks and blankets. The loom was a large wooden frame, and the process of weaving was a slow, rhythmic dance of the hands. Lift the warp, pass the weft. Lift the warp, pass the weft. Pack the threads tight with a wooden batten. The clack-thud of the loom is the heartbeat of the winter house. It is a sound of productivity without stress, of creation without hurry. Each row of the weave represents a portion of the afternoon, a quiet victory over the cold. As part one of our story draws to a close, we find ourselves drifting deeper into the comfort of our sanctuary. The fire in the hearth has settled into a deep, glowing red. The snow outside has piled high against the door, sealing us in a cocoon of warmth and silence. The great myths are beginning to stir, but they are still in their infancy, as quiet and unformed as the thoughts of a person on the verge of sleep. We are at the beginning of a very long, very peaceful journey through the landscape of the ancient mind. There is no rush to reach the end. There is only the here and the now, the texture of the wool, the scent of the pine, and the steady, hypnotic falling of the snow. The darkness of the void is no longer a mystery, but a familiar friend, a soft blanket that covers the world and prepares it for the stories to come. We close our eyes and listen to the silence of the Pindus Mountains, a silence that is heavy with the weight of time and the promise of rest. The world is safe. The world is warm. The world is waiting for the dawn, but the dawn is many, many hours away. For now, there is only the winter, the hearth, and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the earth. The golden age was not golden because of the glitter of coins or the shine of polished crowns, but because of the quality of the light, a low, honey-colored glow that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Under the reign of the Titan Cronus, time did not pulse with urgency. It flowed with the heavy, viscous consistency of cold oil. It was a period of profound equilibrium, where the seasons moved through their cycles with a predictable, rhythmic grace. In our winter sanctuary, we lean closer to the warmth of the hearth and imagine the palace of the Titans, perched high upon the frozen shoulders of Mount Athres. This palace was not built for defense, for there was no one to defend against. It was built for the quiet contemplation of the elements. The walls were made of blocks of pale, translucent marble hewn from the deep veins of the earth by the hands of the Cyclopes. Each block was so perfectly fitted to its neighbor that the seams were invisible, creating a single, continuous surface that felt as smooth as a frozen pond under the palm of one's hand. The marble was cool to the touch, a refreshing contrast to the warmth of the heavy wool tunics worn by the inhabitants. If you were to run your fingers along these walls, you would feel only a slight, rhythmic vibration, the heartbeat of the mountain itself, a low-frequency hum that served as the world's fundamental tone. Inside the halls of Athres, the atmosphere was one of industrious silence. Rhea, the queen of the Titans, moved through these spaces with a deliberate, unhurried pace. Her primary concern was the stewardship of the domestic sphere, the maintenance of the cosmic household. We can visualize her in a small, well-ordered room, lit by the pale light of a winter morning filtering through high, narrow windows. On her lap lies a great pile of raw flax, a soft, silver-gray bundle that smells of sun-drenched fields and dry earth. Rhea is engaged in the task of spinning. The process is a masterpiece of monotony. Her fingers, long and steady, pluck a tuft of flax and draw it out into a fine, consistent strand. She twists the strand between her thumb and forefinger, then attaches it to a spindle of polished ebony. With a gentle flick of her wrist, she sets the spindle spinning. It hangs in the air, a dark blur of motion, turning with a soft whir. That is the only sound in the room. The whir rises and falls in pitch as the spindle gathers speed and then slowly decelerates. It is a hypnotic sound, an acoustic anchor that grounds the mind in the present moment. As the thread grows longer, Rhea winds it onto the spindle, creating a neat, symmetrical cone of silver yarn. Each revolution of the spindle is a moment of peace. Each foot of thread is a testament to the beauty of the mundane. She does not think of the future or the past. She thinks only of the tension of the fiber, the smoothness of the twist, and the steady weight of the spindle pulling toward the floor. In this task, there is no room for conflict or doubt. There is only the flax, the thread, and the endless, soothing rotation. Outside, the landscape of the Golden Age is a study in white and blue. The snow does not fall in storms. It descends in a gentle, persistent drizzle of frost. It settles on the needles of the ancient cedar trees, creating delicate, crystalline structures that look like lace. The trees do not groan under the weight. They stand tall and patient, their roots anchored deep in the frozen soil. The air is so still that you can hear the sound of a single snowflake landing on a drift, a tiny tink, like a grain of sand hitting a sheet of silk. Cronus, the king of time, spends his days in the high gardens of the palace. These are not gardens of flowers and fruits, but gardens of stone and ice. He walks along paths of crushed white quartz, the sound of his footsteps a rhythmic crunch-crunch that echoes softly against the marble walls. He is checking the alignment of the sundials, great monoliths of obsidian that mark the passage of the hours. The shadow of the gnomon moves with agonizing slowness across the etched lines of the stone. It takes an entire afternoon for the shadow to move the width of a finger. Cronus watches this movement with a calm, unblinking gaze. He understands that time is a resource to be savored, not a race to be won. In one corner of the garden, there is a small spring that never freezes. The water bubbles up from the earth at a constant temperature, sending a thin plume of steam into the cold air. The steam curls and twists, forming intricate patterns that vanish as quickly as they appear. The sound of the water is a gentle glug-glug, a liquid music that provides a counterpoint to the silence of the snow. Cronus takes a silver ladle and dips it into the water. He watches the surface tension break, the ripples expanding in perfect, concentric circles. He lifts the ladle and pours the water slowly back into the spring. The splash tinkle of the water is a sound of pure logistics, gravity and fluid dynamics working in perfect, boring harmony. As the evening approaches, Rhea moves from her spinning to the preparation of the evening meal. This is not a feast of indulgence, but a ritual of nourishment. She takes a heavy clay bowl and fills it with grains of pearled barley. The grains are hard and smooth, like tiny, pale beads. She begins to grind them using a stone mortar and pestle. The grind-scrape is a repetitive, earthy sound. The smell of the bruised grain is sweet and wholesome, reminding her of the summer harvest. She adds water to the ground barley, stirring it with a wooden spoon until it forms a thick, consistent paste. She then places the bowl near the edge of the hearth, where the gentle heat will slowly cook the porridge. There is no urgency to the cooking. The heat seeps into the clay, then into the barley, transforming it over the course of several hours into a warm, comforting meal. Rhea sits by the fire, watching the small bubbles rise to the surface of the porridge and pop with a soft puff. It is a miniature volcano of domesticity, a small, controlled warmth in the heart of the winter palace. When the meal is ready, she serves it in simple bowls of carved olive wood. The wood is dark and oily, with a complex grain that tells the story of centuries of growth. The steam from the porridge rises in a steady column, warming her face. She eats slowly, savoring the texture of the grain and the warmth of the bowl against her palms. There is a deep satisfaction in the completion of these simple tasks, the spinning, the grinding, the cooking. They are the stitches that hold the fabric of the world together. In this era, the birth of the first Olympians was not a moment of drama, but a continuation of the cycle. When Rhea felt the time approaching for the birth of her children, she prepared with the same methodical care she applied to her weaving. She gathered the softest fleeces from the mountain sheep, washing them in the spring water until they were white as the snow outside. She carded the wool until it was a cloud of lightness, then spun it into a thread so fine it was almost invisible. She wove the swaddling clothes, long, narrow strips of woolen cloth that would wrap the infants in a cocoon of warmth. We can imagine her sitting in the dim light of the nursery, the floor covered in thick rugs of bearskin. She folds the swaddling clothes with precision, smoothing out every wrinkle with the side of her hand. The cloth is soft and warm, smelling of dried lavender, and the clean, cold air of the mountains. When the infants were born, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, they were immediately wrapped in these clothes. The process of swaddling is a repetitive, rhythmic act. First, the feet are tucked in, then the arms are laid flat against the body, and finally, the cloth is wound round and round, tight enough to provide security but loose enough to allow the breath to flow easily. The infants did not cry. They were lulled into a deep, dreamless sleep by the warmth and the rhythmic movement of Rhea's hands. Cronus, ever mindful of the passage of time and the preservation of the current order, took each child in turn. But in our story, this is not an act of violence. It is an act of storage. He did not devour them in the sense of destruction. He took them into himself, into the vast, dark safety of his own being. Imagine it as a vault of eternal stillness, a place where time stands still. Inside Cronus, the children remained in their swaddling clothes, suspended in a state of perfect, boring peace. They did not age. They did not hunger. They simply were. They were like seeds stored in a granary during a long winter, waiting for the right moment to be planted. The nursery remained quiet. Rhea would continue her work, her hands never idle. She would sweep the floor with her heather broom, the shish-shish sound echoing in the empty room. She would dust the wooden cradles which sat unused in the corner, their rockers silent on the rugs. There was no sadness in this silence, only the patience of the earth. She knew that everything had its season, and the season of the Olympians was not yet here. As the final infant, Zeus, was born, Rhea decided to change the routine. She traveled to the island of Crete, to a deep, hidden cave on the slopes of Mount Ida. The journey was slow and methodical. She walked through the snow-covered forests, her boots making a steady crunch-thud on the frozen ground. The air was sharp and clear, tasting of pine and ozone. The cave on Mount Ida was a sanctuary of natural beauty. The walls were covered in a thick layer of moss that dampened all sound. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like frozen tiers of stone, and stalagmites rose from the floor to meet them. In the center of the cave, a small fire burned, tended by the nymphs. The smoke was sweet and thin, rising to the ceiling where it left a faint, gray stain on the limestone. Here, Zeus was placed in a cradle of gold, but the gold was not polished to a shine. It was a matte, brushed gold that felt warm to the touch. The nymphs cared for him with the same boring consistency that Rhea had shown her other children. They fed him the milk of the goat Amalthea. We can hear the sound of the milk hitting the bottom of a bronze pail, a rhythmic ping-ping-ping that slowly turns into a muffled slosh-slosh as the pail fills. The milk was warm and rich, smelling of wild herbs and mountain air. Zeus grew in the silence of the cave. His only entertainment was the sound of the Curetes, the young guardians who stood outside the cave. They did not dance with violence. They performed a rhythmic, metallic ceremony. They would strike their spears against their shields in a slow, steady cadence. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was not jarring. It was a low-frequency pulse that masked any sound the infant might make. It was like the ticking of a great, celestial clock, a sound that reinforced the order and safety of the hidden sanctuary. In the cave, the time passed like the dripping of water from a stalactite. Each drop was a second, each puddle a century. Zeus lay in his cradle, watching the shadows dance on the mossy walls. He felt the warmth of the fire, the softness of the wool blankets, and the steady, hypnotic beat of the shields. He was safe, he was warm, and he was profoundly, beautifully bored. The world outside continued its slow, winter rotation, unaware of the change that was coming. But for now, the stillness of the Golden Age remained unbroken. The transition from the reign of the Titans to the era of the Olympians was not a thunderous upheaval, but rather a slow shift in the world's internal clock, like the imperceptible turning of a great, rusted gear. In our winter-bound sanctuary, we watch the frost continue to bloom across the stone window frames, creating intricate, fern-like patterns that catch the dim light of the hearth. Inside the cave on Mount Ida, the young Zeus had reached his full stature, yet his life remained one of profound, rhythmic simplicity. The cave had become a temple of the mundane, a place where the passage of time was measured in the replenishment of supplies and the slow aging of mountain cheeses. The nymphs who tended to the young god were masters of the domestic arts. Their days were filled with the logistics of sustenance and the maintenance of their hidden home. We can imagine the process of making cheese from the milk of the goat Amalthea. It began in the early hours of the morning, when the air inside the cave was at its crispest. The milk was kept in large, shallow basins of hammered bronze. The surface of the milk was as smooth and white as a fresh snowdrift. A nymph would take a small wooden paddle and stir the milk with a slow, circular motion. The sound was a soft, liquid swish-swish, a sound that seemed to pull the very spirit of the mountain into the basin. They would add a few drops of rennet, derived from the wild herbs that grew near the cave's mouth. Then they would wait. This waiting was a central part of their lives, a period of absolute stillness. For hours, the milk would sit undisturbed, slowly thickening, transforming from a liquid into a delicate, trembling curd. To check its progress, a nymph would gently press the back of a silver spoon against the surface. The resistance of the curd was a tactile language, a way of communicating with the chemistry of the world. Once the curd had set, it was cut into small, uniform cubes using a thin wire. The zip-zip of the wire through the soft white mass was a satisfying, clean sound. The curds were then scooped into baskets woven from split willow branches. The drip, drip, drip of the whey falling from the baskets into the stone floor was a constant, hypnotic background noise. It was a rhythmic percussion that never varied, a liquid clock counting down the afternoon. The baskets were weighted down with heavy, flat stones, limestone discs that had been polished by the mountain streams until they were as smooth as silk. These stones provided a steady, unrelenting pressure, squeezing out the last of the moisture until the cheese was firm and dense. The resulting wheels of cheese were rubbed with coarse gray sea salt, which felt like sand against the skin. The salt would crackle and crunch as it was massaged into the rinds. Finally, the wheels were placed on shelves of aged cedar, tucked away in the deepest, coolest recesses of the cave. There they would sit for months, their rinds turning a dusty gold, smelling of salt, earth, and the passing of the seasons. This was the diet of the young Zeus, simple, nourishing, and born of a process that required no hurry, only the patient application of gravity and time. While Zeus grew in the quietude of the cave, His mother, Rhea, was engaged in her own long-form plan of logistics. The time had come for the great exchange, the moment when she would present Cronus with a substitute for his final child. She did not seek out a weapon, she sought out a stone. We can imagine Rhea walking along the banks of a high mountain stream, where the water had retreated during the winter, leaving behind a field of smooth, water-worn boulders. She spent hours examining the stones. She was looking for a specific weight, a specific density, something that would feel significant in the hands of a titan. She picked up one stone of dark basalt, but it was too jagged, its edges still sharp from a recent fracture. She put it back and continued her search. She found a piece of white quartz, but it was too light, feeling hollow and insubstantial. Finally, she discovered a large, egg-shaped stone of gray limestone. It was perfectly rounded, its surface polished by centuries of rushing water until it felt almost soft to the touch. It was heavy, grounding, and possessed a quiet permanence. This would be the stone. She carried the stone back to her chamber in the palace of Athens. There, she prepared it with the same care she would have given her own child. She took the finest wool she had spun, wool that was as soft as a cloud and smelled of dried chamomile. She began the process of swaddling. Round and round she wound the long strips of cloth, overlapping them with mathematical precision. The rustle of the wool against the stone was a dry, comforting sound. She smoothed out every fold, every stray fiber, until the stone was encased in a thick, warm cocoon. To anyone who touched it, it would feel solid, heavy, and swaddled in the traditional manner of the gods. The exchange itself was a masterpiece of slow-motion theater. Rhea presented the swaddled stone to Cronus in the dim, golden light of the throne room. There were no words spoken, only the sound of her footsteps on the marble floor and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the King of Time. Cronus took the bundle with his large, steady hands. He felt the weight of the limestone through the layers of wool. He felt the coolness of the stone's core. To him, it was merely another unit of the future to be stored away. He took it into himself, adding it to the quiet vault where his other children waited. The world did not tremble. The stars did not blink. The logistics of the cosmos had simply been adjusted by one small, heavy variable. Years passed, slow, monotonous years of winter and stone. The time finally arrived for the release of the Olympians. This was not a moment of violence, but a process of gentle emergence. Zeus, now grown, returned to the palace of Athens. He brought with him a special draught prepared by the nymphs, not a poison, but a potent, herbal tea made from the roots of the world and the nectar of the highest peaks. The tea was a deep amber color, smelling of honey and bitter herbs. It was served in a bowl of polished obsidian, a dark, reflective vessel that held the heat for a long time. Cronus drank the tea slowly. We can hear the sound of the liquid being swallowed, a rhythmic gulp-pause-gulp. As the tea worked its way through his being, the storage within him began to loosen. It was like the thawing of a frozen river in the early spring. Slowly, one by one, the swaddled bundles were released. First came the stone, hitting the floor with a dull, heavy thud that echoed through the hall. Then came the others, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. They did not emerge as angry warriors, but as individuals waking from a very long, very refreshing nap. They unwound their swaddling clothes with slow, deliberate movements. The wool fell to the floor in soft piles. They stretched their limbs, feeling the air against their skin for the first time in an age. Their eyes adjusted to the golden light of the palace. There was no shouting, no rush to battle. Instead, there was a collective, quiet realization that a new chapter had begun. They were the Olympians, and they had a new home to prepare. The relocation to Mount Olympus was a study in high-altitude logistics. Olympus was a different kind of mountain than Othrys, taller, sharper, its peaks piercing the very ether of the heavens. The air here was thin and sweet, so clear that it felt like drinking cold water. The gods did not build a fortress, they built a residence. They spent their first centuries on the mountain simply arranging the space. Imagine the goddess Hestia establishing the first central hearth of the Olympian palace. This was the most important task of all. She chose a spot in the exact center of the great hall, where the floor was made of solid, unyielding granite. She began by gathering the stones for the hearth ring. These were not common rocks, but stones of volcanic glass and river jade, each one chosen for its ability to hold and radiate heat. She placed them one by one, creating a perfect circle. The clink-clonk of the stones as they settled into place was the first music of the new era. Then came the gathering of the wood. Hestia preferred the wood of the ancient mountain oaks, trees that had grown slowly for 1,000 years. This wood was dense, heavy, and held a deep, resonant energy. She would spend her afternoons splitting the logs. The sound of the bronze axe hitting the wood was a rhythmic thwack, followed by the satisfying crack of the grain giving way. She would then stack the wood in neat geometric piles, rows of split logs, arranged so that the air could circulate between them. The smell of the fresh-cut oak was sharp and tannic, filling the hall with a sense of stability. Starting the fire was a ritual of patience. Hestia did not use a spark of lightning. She used the traditional method of the fire drill. She took a spindle of hard laurel wood and a baseboard of softer cedar. She placed the spindle in a small notch in the board and began to rotate it between her palms. The shur-shur-shur of the wood-on-wood friction was a dry, hypnotic sound. A thin wisp of smoke would appear, smelling of toasted wood. Then a tiny, glowing ember would form, a single point of orange light in the vast, quiet hall. She would gently transfer the ember to a nest of dried tinder, shredded birch bark, and fine, dry grass. She would blow on it with a soft, steady breath, her cheeks moving in a rhythmic bellows. The ember would grow, the tinder would catch, and a small, flickering flame would begin to lick at the smaller twigs. This fire was the heartbeat of Olympus. It was a boring, steady, beautiful heat that would never be allowed to go out. Hestia would sit by it for hours, her hands resting on her knees, watching the way the flames consumed the wood, not with hunger but with a slow, methodical grace. Meanwhile, the goddess Demeter was focusing on the logistics of the earth's crust. She was the mistress of the grain, but before there could be harvests, there had to be the categorization of the seeds. We can imagine her in a quiet room on the lower slopes of Olympus, where the air was a bit warmer and the soil was rich and dark. The room was filled with hundreds of small clay jars, each one containing a different type of seed. Demeter spent her days sorting. She would pour a handful of seeds onto a large wooden tray. There were the long, elegant grains of winter wheat, the stout, bearded seeds of barley, the tiny, dark pearls of poppy, and the hard, triangular seeds of buckwheat. She would move them across the tray with her fingertips, grouping them by size, weight, and color. The sound of the seeds sliding across the wood was a soft, dry hiss, like the sound of distant rain. Hiss, hiss, hiss. It was a sound that could put the world to sleep. She was looking for the most resilient seeds, the ones that could withstand the weight of the snow and the bite of the frost. She would hold a single grain of wheat up to the light, examining the tiny crease that ran down its center. She would feel its texture, smooth, dry, and full of potential energy. Once a jar was filled with perfect seeds, she would seal it with a plug of beeswax, ensuring that the life inside remained dormant and safe until the logistics of the seasons called for its planting. In these early days of Olympus, there was no drama, only the settling into a new routine. The gods were like craftsmen in a new workshop, each finding their place, each mastering their tools. The winter wind might whistle around the high marble columns of the palace, and the snow might pile high against the silver gates, but inside, there was only the steady glow of Hestia's fire and the rhythmic sorting of Demeter's seeds. The world was in a state of perfect, monotonous preparation. The great stories were being written in the details, in the grain of the wood, the texture of the stone, and the slow, hypnotic movement of the fire. As we drift further into the night, we feel the weight of this ancient peace, the comfort of a world where everything has its place, and there is all the time in the universe to ensure that it stays there. As the architecture of Olympus began to take shape, the focus of the gods shifted from the grand design of the halls to the meticulous logistics of their internal workings. In our sanctuary, the snow has now reached the midpoint of the heavy oak door, creating a natural insulation that muffles the outside world into a deep, velvety silence. On the heights of Olympus, the god Hephaestus moved into his designated workspace, the Great Forge. This was not a place of chaotic fire and clanging iron, but a sanctuary of thermal management and rhythmic precision. The forge was situated in a deep, basalt-lined chamber where the natural heat of the mountain's core could be harnessed. The air here was warm and dry, a pleasant contrast to the crisp, thin air of the upper terraces. Hephaestus began his day with the preparation of the charcoal. This was a slow, dusty, and profoundly repetitive task. He used charcoal made from the dense wood of the home oak, which had been charred in airtight kilns for weeks until every drop of moisture was gone. The charcoal pieces were light, porous, and a deep, iridescent black. Hephaestus would take a large wicker basket and begin to sort the charcoal by size. He sat on a low stool carved from a single block of stone. The scuff-scuff of the charcoal against the wicker was a dry, grainy sound. He would pick up a piece, feel its weight, and place it into one of 3 stone bins. The larger pieces were for the base of the fire, the medium pieces for the core, and the fine dust for the finishing work. Clink, scritch, clink. The rhythm was as steady as a heartbeat. He spent hours in this sorting, his hands becoming coated in a fine, silver-gray soot that felt like silk against his skin. Once the bins were filled, he turned his attention to the bellows. These were massive lungs made of supple ox hide, reinforced with ribs of polished bronze. The operation of the bellows was a masterclass in monotonous movement. Hephaestus used a simple foot treadle system. He would press down, and the bellows would exhale a long, steady whoosh of air into the heart of the forge. He would release, and the leather would expand with a soft, creaking HNNG creak. The air would feed the embers, turning them from a dull cherry red to a bright, pulsing orange. He did not want a raging inferno. He wanted a boring heat, a constant, unwavering temperature that would allow the metal to soften without melting into a liquid. He would watch the heat shimmer above the coals, a transparent ripple in the air that made the basalt walls seem to breathe. For hours he would maintain this rhythm: press, whoosh, release, creak. Press, whoosh, release, creak. It was a mechanical meditation, a way of anchoring the high mountain to the steady pulse of the earth. In the center of the chamber sat the anvil. It was a massive block of meteoric iron, its surface polished to a mirror-like finish through centuries of use. Hephaestus was working on the creation of the first set of bronze hand tools for the other gods, simple things like needles for Athena and shears for Demeter. He took a small ingot of bronze, a dull golden brick, and placed it in the center of the coals using long-handled tongs. The tongs were heavy and balanced, their hinge moving with a silent, oiled smoothness. He waited. He did not rush the metal. He watched the bronze change color, moving through shades of brown, deep red, and finally a soft, glowing orange. When the metal reached the consistency of warm wax, he moved it to the anvil. He took his hammer, not a heavy sledge, but a light, precision tool with a head of tempered steel. The striking of the metal was a rhythmic ceremony. Tink, tink, thud, tink, tink, thud. The two light strikes were to test the resistance of the metal, and the third, heavier strike was to shape it. The sound was not jarring, it was musical. The vibrations from the anvil traveled up Hephaestus's arm and into his chest, a resonant frequency that seemed to align his very soul with the material world. He would strike the metal 100 times, then return it to the coals to maintain the heat. The process of making a single needle could take an entire afternoon. He would taper the end with agonizing slowness, rotating the bronze a fraction of a millimeter between each strike. The result was a tool of perfect symmetry, a physical manifestation of patience. While the forge hummed with its steady warmth, the goddess Athena was establishing the great weaving room on the eastern wing of the palace. This was a room of light and mathematics. The floors were paved with tiles of pale blue limestone, which felt cool and smooth underfoot. The walls were lined with shelves holding hundreds of spindles of thread, organized by shade and material. Athena's primary focus was the maintenance of the great loom. This was a vertical loom of immense proportions, its frame made of seasoned olive wood that had been rubbed with oil until it glowed like honey. The logistics of the loom were staggering. Thousands of warp threads, the vertical strands, had to be hung and weighted. Athena did this herself, a task that required a level of focus that was entirely hypnotic. She would take a single thread of fine, white wool. She would loop it over the top bar, bring it down to the floor, and tie it to a small clay weight. Each weight was a perfect sphere of fired earth, weighing exactly the same as its neighbor. Clack! She would drop the weight. Clack! Another weight. She did this 3,000 times. The sound of the weights hitting each other as they settled was like the sound of 1,000 tiny bells, a soft, muffled tinkle-clack that filled the room. Once the warp was set, the weaving could begin. Athena moved the shuttle, a smooth, boat-shaped piece of wood, back and forth through the threads. Swoosh, thud, swoosh, thud. The swoosh was the shuttle sliding between the threads, and the thud was the wooden batten packing the new row of thread into place. She was weaving a tapestry of the winter sky. She would select a thread of deep indigo, then a thread of slate gray, then a thread of silver. She spent hours on a single inch of fabric. Her eyes followed the intersection of the threads, her fingers ensuring that the tension was consistent across the entire width of the loom. There was no room for error, but there was also no room for haste. The weaving was a manifestation of the order she brought to the world. It was a boring, beautiful, repetitive act of creation. The smell of the room was the smell of clean wool and dry wood, a scent that invited the mind to wander and then to settle into a deep, peaceful stasis. On the lower levels of the palace, the god Hermes was occupied with the logistics of the archives. Before the gods could govern, they needed to categorize the world. Hermes was the master of the list. We can imagine him in a quiet, circular room with high ceilings. The room was filled with wooden cabinets, each containing hundreds of small parchment scrolls. Hermes sat at a desk of polished cedar. On the desk were several small inkwells made of glass, filled with inks of different colors, black from soot, red from ochre, blue from lapis lazuli. He held a quill made from the feather of a mountain eagle. The quill was light and balanced. He would dip the quill into the inkwell, a soft clink of the nib against the glass, and then begin to write. The sound of the quill on the parchment was a dry, scratching, scritch, scritch, scritch. It was a tiny, intimate sound that seemed to amplify the silence of the room. Hermes was recording the inventory of the world's mountains. He would write the name of a peak, its height in cubits, the type of stone it was made of, and the species of trees that grew on its slopes. The Pindus, 4,000 cubits, limestone, home oak and cedar. He wrote with a steady, flowing hand. He did not rush. Each letter was formed with the same deliberate care. When he finished a scroll, he would wait for the ink to dry. This was a period of absolute stillness. He would watch the wet, black ink lose its shine as it soaked into the fibers of the parchment. Then he would take a small pinch of fine, white sand and sprinkle it over the writing to ensure it was set. The hiss of the sand hitting the parchment was like the sound of a distant wave. He would then roll the scroll tightly, tie it with a piece of linen twine, and place it in its designated slot in the cabinet. Slide, click. The archive grew, one scroll at a time, a boring but essential record of everything that was. Outside the palace, the winter continued its slow, heavy dance. The god Apollo, who would one day be the god of the sun, was currently tasked with the maintenance of the great sundial of Olympus. In the winter, the sun was a pale, distant thing, and the movement of the shadows was even slower than usual. Apollo would stand on the central plaza, his feet planted firmly on the snow-dusted marble. The sundial was a massive obsidian needle, casting a shadow across a field of white quartz. Apollo's job was to ensure that the quartz stayed level and clear of snow so that the shadow remained sharp. He used a long-handled broom made of stiff straw. The swish-swish of the broom against the stone was a rhythmic, sweeping sound. He would clear a section, move a step, and clear the next. He moved in a circle, following the path of the sun. He was not looking for grand revelations. He was looking for the precise moment when the shadow crossed a specific line etched into the stone. When it did, He would take a small silver mallet and strike a bronze gong. Gong! The sound was deep and resonant, traveling through the cold air and into the halls of the palace. It was the signal that 1 hour had passed and another had begun. It was the heartbeat of the mountain, a reminder that even in the stillness of winter, the world was moving forward with a steady, predictable grace. As evening fell on Olympus, the gods would gather in the central hall, near Hestia's hearth. There was no grand feast, just the simple gathering of individuals who had spent their day in the service of the mundane. They would sit on the thick rugs of wool and fur, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. They might share a bowl of the barley porridge Demeter had prepared, or a slice of the cheese the nymphs had made in the cave of Zeus. The conversation was low and sparse. They might discuss the tension of the loom, the temperature of the forge, or the drying time of the ink. These were the things that mattered. These were the logistics of their lives. The warmth of the hearth seeped into their bones, relaxing muscles that had been held in the steady positions of their crafts. They felt the weight of the mountain beneath them and the vastness of the winter sky above. In our own sanctuary, we feel this same sense of settling. The story of the gods is not a story of drama, but a story of the beauty of the routine. It is the story of the thread, the stone, the grain, and the flame. As we close our eyes, we can hear the tink of Hephaestus's hammer, the swoosh of Athena's shuttle, and the scritch of Hermes's quill. They are the sounds of a world that is safe, ordered, and profoundly at peace. The winter night is long, and there is no reason to wake. The gods are at their work, the fire is tended, and the snow continues to fall, silent and steady, over the sleeping earth. The winter night deepens, and the snow outside our stone walls has formed drifts that reach the lower eaves of the roof. The silence of the world is now absolute, a thick, insulating layer of white that separates us from the passage of hours. Inside, our hearth continues to pulse with a steady, ruby-red warmth. The fire has reached that stage of maturity where the wood has been transformed into a mountain of glowing coals, each one a miniature sun, vibrating with a heat so consistent it feels like a physical weight upon the skin. We settle deeper into our chairs, feeling the coarse, comforting weave of our wool blankets, and turn our minds back to the high, quiet halls of Olympus and the valleys of the early world below. In this era of the world's unfolding, the focus turned toward the creation of the mortal inhabitants of the earth. This task was not a sudden burst of magic, but a long, methodical project of craftsmanship undertaken by the Titan Prometheus. Prometheus was known for his foresight, which in our story translates to a profound appreciation for logistics and the slow, necessary steps of a complex process. He did not simply wish humans into existence. He engineered them from the raw materials of the earth, treating the task with the same boring, beautiful attention to detail that a potter gives to a cherished vessel. We can imagine Prometheus descending from the heights of Olympus to a secluded valley where a slow-moving river meandered through a plain of fine, gray silt. It was a winter morning, much like our own, where the frost had turned the riverbanks into a brittle, silver landscape. The air was perfectly still, smelling of damp stone and the sharp, metallic tang of ice. Prometheus sought a specific kind of clay, a clay that was neither too sandy nor too rich in organic matter, but a balanced, plastic medium that would hold its shape through the long drying process. He spent days simply walking along the riverbed, his boots making a soft squelch crunch in the half-frozen mud. He carried a small wooden trowel and a linen bag. Every few yards, he would stop, kneel, and take a small sample of the earth. He would roll the clay between his palms, feeling for the grit of quartz or the slipperiness of mica. He was looking for a smooth consistency, a texture like cold butter that would respond to the lightest pressure of a fingertip. The sound of his hands rubbing together was a soft, rhythmic hiss-hiss, a sound of tactile exploration. When he finally found the perfect deposit of clay, he began the process of collection. This was a task of repetitive motion. He would cut out a square block of the heavy gray earth, lift it with both hands, and place it in his basket. Each block weighed approximately 10 mini. He moved with a deliberate slowness, mindful of the strain on his back and the balance of the basket. Thud, shloop, thud. The sound of the clay being harvested was the sound of the earth giving up its secrets. He gathered 100 blocks, enough for a winter's work, and transported them back to his workshop, a cave built into the side of a limestone cliff, warmed by a small, steady peat fire. Inside the workshop, the first step was wedging the clay. This is a monotonous but essential process of removing air bubbles and ensuring the moisture is evenly distributed. Prometheus would take a lump of clay and throw it down onto a heavy stone table. Slap. He would then push it away with the heels of his hands, fold it back, and rotate it 90 degrees. Push, fold, turn. Slap. Push, fold, turn, slap. He did this for hours. The rhythm became a form of clockwork. The smell of the damp, cold clay filled the workshop, an earthy, ancient scent that spoke of the deep layers of the world. The sound of the wedging was hypnotic. Slap, pause, thud, slap, pause, thud. If an air bubble remained, it would cause the clay to crack or explode during the drying process, so Prometheus was unhurried. He treated every lump of clay as if it were the only one in existence. His hands became coated in a fine gray slip, a liquid clay that felt like silk and dried into a pale, crackling mask on his skin. He would occasionally dip his hands into a bowl of warm water, the splash swish, a gentle interruption to the thudding of the clay. Once the clay was prepared, the molding began. Prometheus did not use a wheel. He used the method of coiling and pinching. To create the form of a human limb, he would first roll out a long, thin snake of clay on the stone table. His hands moved back and forth with a steady, even pressure, transforming the lump into a cylinder. The roll, roll, roll sound of the clay on the stone was a soft, dry vibration. He would then take the coil and wind it upward, layer by layer, pinching the edges together to create a solid form. The shaping of the features was the most monotonous part of all. Imagine the task of creating 10 fingers for a single figure. Each finger required a tiny amount of clay, rolled into a precise taper, then smoothed into the hand with a small bone tool. Prometheus would spend an entire afternoon on a single hand. He would use the tool to indent the knuckles, to shape the curve of the fingernails, and to create the fine lines of the palm. The scritch-scrape of the bone tool against the damp clay was a tiny, intimate sound that filled the silence of the cave. He worked with a magnifying lens made of polished rock crystal, his eyes focused on the microscopic details of the skin's texture. When the figures were finished, they were not yet alive. They were greenware, fragile, cold, and heavy with water. They had to be dried with extreme care. If they dried too fast, the outer surface would shrink while the core remained wet, causing deep, irreparable fissures. Prometheus established a drying rack in the rear of the cave, away from the direct heat of the fire. He covered the figures in damp linen cloths to slow the evaporation. Every day for 40 days he would perform the turning of the linen. He would walk to the rack, the sound of his footsteps a soft tap-tap on the stone floor. He would gently lift the cloth, check the color of the clay, which turned from a dark charcoal to a pale, chalky gray as it dried, and then redampen the linen using a spray of water from a ceramic bottle. The mist of the water hitting the cloth was a cool, refreshing sound. This was the logistics of life, the management of moisture, the regulation of temperature, and the infinite patience of the Creator. While the figures dried, Prometheus turned his attention to the problem of warmth. The world was cold, and his creations, once animated, would need a way to maintain their internal temperature. He decided to bring them the gift of fire, but the logistics of transporting a living flame from the hearth of Olympus to the valleys below required careful planning. He did not want a wildfire. He wanted a domesticated spark. He chose a giant stalk of fennel to serve as his vessel. Fennel is a remarkable plant. Its outer rind is tough and green, but its interior is filled with a dry, spongy pith that burns very slowly, like a natural wick. Prometheus spent an afternoon preparing the stalk. He used a sharp bronze knife to hollow out the center, leaving a thick layer of pith at the bottom. The shave of the knife against the woody stalk was a crisp, rhythmic sound. He then gathered char cloth, linen rags that had been scorched in a fire until they were black and brittle. He packed the char cloth into the base of the fennel stalk. The theft of the fire was a quiet, stealthy act of logistics. He entered the great hall of Olympus while the other gods were occupied with their own boring tasks, Athena at her loom, Hephaestus at his sorting. He approached Hestia's hearth, the central point of all warmth. He did not take a burning log. He took a single, glowing coal no larger than a walnut. He used a pair of silver tweezers to lift the coal. He watched it glow in the dim light, a tiny heart of amber. He placed the coal into the fennel stalk, right on top of the char cloth. He then capped the stalk with a plug of green wood, leaving only a tiny air hole the size of a pinprick. The logistics were perfect. The green wood prevented the stalk from catching fire, the char cloth provided a steady fuel, and the tiny air hole allowed just enough oxygen to keep the coal breathing without letting it flare up. As he descended the mountain, he held the fennel stalk close to his chest. He could feel the warmth of the coal through the thick green rind, a steady, comforting heat that felt like a heartbeat. He walked through the snow, his breath forming small clouds in the air. The crunch of his boots was the only sound in the frozen wilderness. Inside the stalk, the fire was safe. It was a portable hearth, a masterpiece of thermal insulation. When he reached his cave, he opened the stalk and blew gently into the air hole. A thin, sweet-smelling ribbon of smoke emerged. He had brought the fire not as a weapon, but as a tool for the maintenance of the home. The final piece of this era's logistics was the creation of the first woman, Pandora, and the vessel she carried. In our story, Pandora was not a source of trouble, but a guardian of supplies. She was crafted by Hephaestus with the same methodical care Prometheus had used for his clay figures, but her jar, the famous Pythos, was a marvel of ceramic engineering. The Pythos was a large, deep-bellied jar made of terracotta. It was designed for the long-term storage of essential goods, olive oil, grain, and wine. Hephaestus spent weeks on its construction. He used the paddle and anvil technique, holding a smooth stone inside the jar while striking the outside with a wooden paddle to compress the clay and make it airtight. Thump slap, thump slap, thump slap. The sound was deep and resonant like a muffled drum. He then applied a slip glaze, a liquid suspension of iron-rich clay that would turn a deep, glossy red in the kiln. He painted the glaze on with a brush made of squirrel hair, moving in long, overlapping strokes. The swish-swish of the brush was a soothing, liquid sound. He decorated the rim with a pattern of meander, a continuous, repeating line that represented the eternal flow of the seasons. The lid of the Pythos was the most important part. It had to be a perfect fit to prevent spoilage. Hephaestus ground the rim of the jar and the underside of the lid with fine emery powder until they were perfectly flat. When the lid was placed on the jar, it created a vacuum seal. The clink hiss of the lid settling into place was a sound of absolute security. This jar was intended to hold the reserve of the world, the extra grain for a long winter, the oil for the darkest nights. It was a vessel of preparedness. As we look at our own hearth, we can imagine the first mortals gathering around their new fires. They would sit just as we are sitting, feeling the warmth seep into their hands and feet. They would watch the fire consume the wood, turning it into the same glowing coals we see before us. They would spend their evenings in the boring, beautiful tasks of survival, mending their fur cloaks with bone needles, grinding their grain in stone mortars, and tending the fire to ensure it never went out. The world of Prometheus and Pandora was a world of slow movements and careful measurements. It was a world where a well-made jar or a hollow fennel stalk was a triumph of the mind. There was no rush to build empires or fight wars. There was only the need to stay warm, to stay fed, and to keep the silence of the winter at bay. We feel the weight of the clay, the warmth of the coal, and the smoothness of the terracotta. The story of humanity begins not with a shout, but with the scritch-scrape of a tool and the whoosh of a gentle breath on a dying ember. The gods are distant, the snow is deep, and the fire is steady. We are safe in our sanctuary, wrapped in the logistics of comfort, as the long winter night continues its slow, hypnotic rotation. There is nothing to fear, nothing to do, but listen to the rhythm of the falling snow and the heartbeat of the ancient world. The winter night outside our sanctuary has reached a state of profound equilibrium. The wind has ceased entirely, leaving the landscape in a frozen, silver stasis. The snow is so deep now that it has completely covered the stone fence surrounding our dwelling, turning the world into a seamless, undulating sea of white. Inside, the fire has settled into its most hypnotic phase. The logs have crumbled into a thick bed of glowing charcoal that looks like a map of a burning city. The heat is steady, a dry and comforting embrace that makes the heavy wool of our blankets feel like a second skin. We are perfectly safe, perfectly warm, and perfectly still. As we watch a single, lazy wisp of smoke rise toward the rafters, We turn our thoughts downward, below the roots of the mountains, below the frozen rivers, into the deep, quiet logistics of the underworld. In the Greek world, the realm of Hades was not a place of chaos or fear, but a masterpiece of administration and thermal consistency. It was the world's great cellar, a place where the air remained at a constant, cool temperature regardless of the blizzards raging on the surface. We can imagine the entrance to this realm, tucked away in a remote valley of the Peloponnese, where a narrow fissure in the limestone leads deep into the earth. There is no gate to crash, only a long, winding staircase carved from the living rock. The descent is a study in acoustics. Each step is a flat, wide slab of gray slate polished by the passage of ages. As you walk down, the sound of your footsteps changes. On the surface, the snow muffled everything, but here, the tap-tap-tap of leather soles on stone echoes with a soft, resonant pock. It is a rhythmic, percussive sound that measures the depth of the descent. The air begins to smell different. It loses the sharp, ozone tang of the winter wind and takes on the scent of damp minerals, cold iron, and the faint, sweet musk of aged parchment. It is a very clean smell, a smell of permanence and order. At the bottom of the stairs lies the river Styx. This is not a rushing torrent, but a wide, slow-moving body of water that has the consistency of dark oil. It flows with a silence that is almost physical. There are no ripples on its surface, no splashes against the banks. The water is a deep, iridescent charcoal color, reflecting the dim, ambient light of the cavern walls. We can imagine the boat of Charon, the ferryman, tied to a dock of petrified wood. Charon's role is the epitome of boring, essential labor. He does not hurry. He does not argue. His entire existence is a series of repetitive, logistical movements. He takes a long pole made of dark ash wood and pushes it into the silty bed of the river. The sure slide of the pole through the water is a liquid, heavy sound. He then leans his weight against the pole, propelling the boat forward in a slow, steady glide. The boat itself is a simple, sturdy craft, its timber seasoned by centuries of dampness. The creak groan of the wood as it settles into the water is a low-frequency vibration that you can feel in your marrow. When the boat reaches the center of the river, Charon lifts the pole. The drip, drip, drip of the Stygian water falling back into the stream is a slow, rhythmic clock. Each drop creates a perfect, silver ring on the dark surface, expanding outward until it touches the hull. The crossing takes exactly 20 minutes. It is a period of absolute stillness, a transit between states of being that requires nothing but the patient observation of the dark water. On the far side of the river stands the palace of Hades. It is a structure of immense weight and architectural precision, built entirely of polished ebony and obsidian. The walls do not reflect light. They absorb it, creating a sense of depth that is profoundly calming. Inside, the god Hades sits at a desk of solid hematite. He is the ultimate bookkeeper, the cosmic registrar. His primary concern is not the judgment of souls, but the accuracy of the census. We can imagine Hades engaged in his daily task, the filing of the records of the departed. He does not use fragile papyrus, which would rot in the damp air of the deep earth. Instead, he uses tablets of thin, hammered lead. The tablets are stacked in neat, heavy piles on his desk. He takes a stylus made of tempered bronze and begins to write. The scratch of the metal on the soft lead is a dry, tactile sound. It is much slower than writing with a pen. Each letter must be pressed into the surface with a steady, consistent pressure. Name, origin, date of transition, inventory of deeds. He moves from one tablet to the next with the regularity of a pendulum. When a tablet is finished, he places it in a slot in the wall. The shirk-clack of the lead sliding into the obsidian shelf is a sound of finality and organization. The library of Hades contains billions of these tablets, a vast, silent archive of everything that has ever lived. There is a deep comfort in this level of detail. Nothing is forgotten. Everything is categorized and stored in its proper place. The room is silent, save for the scratching of the stylus and the occasional rhythmic thump of a lead stack being moved. In the center of the palace, there is a small garden, the only place in the underworld where things grow. This is the domain of Persephone during the winter months. Her presence here is not a tragedy, but a seasonal relocation, a logistical necessity for the balance of the Earth's cycles. We can imagine her tending to the flowers of the deep, pale, papery asphodels that grow without sunlight. The asphodels are a ghostly gray-white, their petals feeling like dry vellum between the fingers. Persephone's task is the maintenance of the bloom. She takes a small silver pair of shears and moves among the rows of flowers. The snip-snip of the shears is a crisp, clean sound in the quiet air. She removes the withered petals, placing them in a basket of woven copper wire. The rustle-rustle of the dry petals is like the sound of fallen leaves in a winter forest. She then takes a small watering can made of translucent quartz and pours a few drops of water at the base of each stalk. The water is from the spring of Mnemosyne, the spring of memory. It is clear and heavy, and the glug-glug as it leaves the can is a liquid music that fills the small garden. The most famous aspect of Persephone's stay in the underworld is the eating of the pomegranate seeds. In our story, this is not an act of trickery, but a study in sensory precision and slow consumption. We can imagine Hades presenting her with a single pomegranate, grown in the volcanic soil of the deep earth. The fruit is a deep, bruised purple, its skin tough and leathery. Persephone takes a small, sharp knife of obsidian and begins to open the fruit. The crack-pop, as the blade pierces the rind, is a satisfying, textured sound. She then pries the fruit open, revealing the internal structure. It is a masterpiece of natural logistics. Hundreds of small, ruby-colored seeds, arils, are packed into tight geometric chambers, separated by thin, bitter membranes of yellow pith. She begins to extract the seeds one by one. This is a task that requires immense patience. She uses her fingertips to gently nudge a seed from its chamber. The seed is cool and damp, feeling like a tiny, smooth gemstone. She places it on a plate of polished silver. Clink. She extracts another. Clink. She does this until she has a small pile of 6 seeds. She then begins to eat them, but she does not rush. She takes a single seed and places it on her tongue. She feels its weight, its smooth surface, and the slight coolness of the juice inside. She presses the seed against the roof of her mouth until it pops, releasing a tiny burst of tart, sweet liquid. She then moves the small, hard seed to the side of her mouth before swallowing. She waits for a full minute before taking the next one. The process of eating 6 seeds takes an entire hour. It is a meditation on flavor and texture, a slow-motion engagement with the physical world that anchors her to the deep, quiet halls of the palace. While Persephone tends her garden, the rest of the underworld operates with the same boring efficiency. The fields of asphodel are not a place of wandering ghosts, but a vast gray lawn that requires constant rhythmic upkeep. There are groups of shades whose task is the leveling of the dust. They use long, flat wooden rakes to smooth the gray soil, ensuring that there are no ripples or mounds. The shish-shish-shish of the rakes on the fine, mineral dust is a hypnotic, sweeping sound. It is a task that never ends, for the dust is constantly settling from the cavern ceiling, but there is no stress in the labor. It is a movement that provides a sense of purpose and order to the long, dark afternoon. Deep in the foundations of the palace, there are the thermal regulators. These are massive, bronze pipes that carry the heat from the Earth's core to the surface. The logistics of the world's warmth are managed here. We can imagine the god Hephaestus visiting this place to check the valves. The pipes are warm to the touch, and if you lean your ear against them, you can hear the hum of the rising heat, a low, constant vibration that sounds like a distant swarm of bees. Hephaestus takes a heavy iron wrench and adjusts a large, circular wheel. The creak-turn-clunk of the metal is a sound of industrial stability. He is ensuring that the heat is distributed evenly, so that the roots of the trees on the surface do not freeze solid. He checks the pressure gauges, small bronze arrows that move across dials etched with ancient numerals. He moves with a deliberate slowness, his boots making a heavy thud-thud on the metal floor. The air here is warmer than in the rest of the palace, smelling of hot bronze and steam. It is a comfortable, mechanical heat that reminds us of the forge and the hearth. As the day, or what passes for day in the underworld, comes to a close, Hades and Persephone gather in the great hall. There is no music, no dancing, just the quiet companionship of two beings who understand the necessity of the dark. They sit in chairs carved from single blocks of anthracite, the cushions made of heavy, black velvet. They might discuss the logistics of the coming spring, the date when the first crocuses will need to be triggered, the volume of water required for the mountain streams, and the schedule for the handover of the seasons. These are not matters of debate, but matters of administrative record. They look at the great obsidian clock on the wall, its pendulum swinging with a slow, heavy thock, thock, thock. Each swing takes 2 seconds. It is the slowest clock in the universe, designed to measure the passage of eternity. In our own sanctuary, we feel the resonance of that clock. We feel the weight of the mountains above us and the steady, cool order of the world below. The underworld is not a place of shadows, but a place of foundations, the deep, quiet cellar where the logistics of life and death are handled with infinite patience. The fire in our hearth has settled even further, the coals now a dark, pulsing crimson. The snow continues to fall outside, adding another millimeter of silence to the world. We are safe, we are warm, and we are part of the great, boring, beautiful rhythm of the cosmos. We close our eyes and listen to the thock of the eternal clock, drifting deeper into the velvety darkness of the winter night. The winter night in our small, stone-walled sanctuary has reached its deepest point. Outside, the world has been rendered a monochrome landscape of white and gray. where the distinction between the land and the sky has blurred into a single, hazy curtain of falling frost. Inside, the fire has entered a state of perfect, steady combustion. The heavy oak logs have been reduced to a thick, incandescent bed of coals, glowing with a deep, pulsing heat that seems to radiate from the very center of the earth. We are tucked safely away, the weight of the wool blankets pressing gently against us, providing a sense of groundedness and security. The scent of the room is now dominated by the sweet, dry aroma of toasted wood and the faint, clean smell of cold stone. In this silence, we turn our internal gaze away from the heights of the mountains and the depths of the earth, and look toward the vast, rhythmic expanse of the sea. In the Greek world, the ocean was not merely a body of water, but a complex logistical system governed by the god Poseidon. In the heart of winter, the sea is at its most monotonous and therefore its most peaceful. Far from the crashing waves of a summer storm, the winter ocean is a study in density and thermal layering. We can imagine the underwater palace of Poseidon, situated in the deep, lightless plains of the Aegean floor. This is a place where the temperature never changes, held at a constant, bracing coolness by the immense pressure of the miles of water above. The palace itself is a masterpiece of organic architecture, built not of stone, but of layers of petrified coral and compressed mother-of-pearl. The walls have a soft, iridescent sheen, reflecting the bioluminescent glow of the deep-sea flora. To touch these walls is to feel a surface that is both smooth and slightly textured, like polished bone. The sound of the palace is a low, constant thrummum, the sound of the entire ocean's weight vibrating in a slow, oceanic frequency. It is a sound that acts as a physical sedative, a deep tissue massage for the mind. Poseidon's daily routine is one of extreme rhythmic precision. He is the administrator of the currents, the god who ensures that the heavy, cold water of the polar regions flows in a steady, predictable loop toward the warmer shallows. We can imagine him in his central hall, which is shaped like the interior of a massive nautilus shell. In the center of the hall stands a device of immense logistical importance, the Great Current Regulator. This is a series of large, bronze vanes, each one shaped like the fin of a whale, mounted on a central axis of obsidian. Poseidon spends hours each day inspecting these vanes. He moves through the water with a slow, weightless grace, his movements unhurried by the friction of the air. He takes a small brush made of stiff whalebone bristles and begins to clean the edges of the bronze. The scuff-scuff of the brush against the metal is a muffled, liquid sound, softened by the density of the water. He is removing the microscopic barnacles and mineral deposits that might disrupt the laminar flow of the water. This is a task of infinite repetition. There are hundreds of veins, and each one must be perfectly smooth. He moves from one to the next, his hands performing the same circular motion, hour after hour. The logistics of the sea also involve the management of the silt. On the ocean floor, the fine gray sediment is constantly settling, a slow-motion rain of mineral dust and organic remains. To prevent the palace from being buried, Poseidon has established a system of silt drains, long, narrow channels carved into the coral floor. We can imagine him checking these drains using a long silver probe. He inserts the probe into the channel, feeling for any resistance. The clink slide of the silver against the coral is a sharp, clear sound in the muffled silence of the deep. If he finds a blockage, he uses a small, hand-held bellows to puff a jet of high-pressure water into the channel, clearing the silt in a small, gray cloud that slowly dissipates into the dark. While Poseidon manages the currents, his consort Amphitrite is occupied with the inventory of the shells. The sea produces millions of shells each year, and each one must be categorized and stored in the great archives of the palace. We can imagine Amphitrite in a room lined with thousands of small cedarwood drawers. Each drawer is filled with a different species of shell: the spiraled whelks, the flat, fan-shaped scallops, the tiny, needle-like turritellas. She spends her afternoon sorting. She takes a large basket of unsorted shells and pours them onto a table of polished green marble. The sound of the shells hitting the stone is a brittle musical clatter-tinkle, like a handful of coins falling onto a glass floor. She picks up a single shell, a small, pink-tinted cowrie. She feels its surface with her thumb. It is as smooth as a porcelain bead. She checks it for symmetry, for the clarity of its markings, and then places it in its designated drawer. Slide, click, she picks up another, a spiny murex. She carefully feels the sharp points, ensuring they are intact. Slide, click. This task is the epitome of boring, beautiful labor. It is a process that could take centuries, and in the timeless world of the deep sea it does. Amphitrite does not feel the rush of the seasons. She only feels the weight of the shell and the coolness of the marble. The room smells of salt, dried kelp, and the faint, sweet scent of the cedar drawers. It is an atmosphere of absolute organization, a place where every object has a place and every place is filled with its proper object. On the upper levels of the sea near the surface, the logistics of winter are more visible. Here, the water is a deep slate gray, and the surface is often covered in a layer of pancake ice, round, flat disks of frozen salt water that jostle against each other with a soft, grinding hush crunch. Poseidon's agents, the tritons, are tasked with the maintenance of the ice margins. They move among the ice floes, ensuring that the breathing holes for the seals and the whales remain open. They use long poles made of narwhal tusk, capped with bronze tips. They move with a rhythmic rowing motion, their tails propelling them through the slushy water. When they find a hole that is beginning to freeze over, they use the bronze tip to gently break the new ice. The crack-tink of the thin ice shattering is a crisp, refreshing sound. They then use the flat of the pole to push the ice shards under the main flow, leaving a clear, dark circle of water. They do this across hundreds of miles of coastline, a monotonous patrol that ensures the survival of the sea's inhabitants. The sound of their breathing, a deep, rhythmic huff-huff, is the only noise in the vast, white silence of the winter sea. Deep within the palace, there is also the Hall of the Tides. This is perhaps the most hypnotic place in the entire Greek world. In the center of the hall is a massive pendulum, suspended from a ceiling so high it is lost in the shadows. The pendulum bob is a sphere of solid lead, the size of a small house, and the cable is made of braided silver wire. The pendulum swings with a slow, majestic regularity, driven by the gravitational pull of the moon. Each swing takes exactly 6 hours. Swoosh, thrummum. The swoosh is the sound of the lead sphere moving through the water, and the thrum is the vibration of the silver cable as it reaches the end of its arc. This pendulum is the master clock for the tides. As it swings toward the land, the water across the entire world begins to rise, inch by inch, foot by foot. As it swings back, the water retreats. We can imagine a group of sea nymphs, the Nereids, whose job is to observe the swing. They sit on benches of smooth basalt, watching the pendulum move. They have large, hourglass-like devices filled with fine white sand. When the pendulum reaches its furthest point, they turn the hourglass. The hiss of the sand beginning its descent is a tiny, dry counterpoint to the massive thrum of the pendulum. They record the time of each swing on tablets of etched copper, ensuring that the rhythm of the world's breathing remains constant. There is no drama here, only the observation of a physical constant. The Nereids do not speak. They only watch and turn, their eyes following the silver cable as it cuts through the dark water. In our own sanctuary, we feel the resonance of this oceanic rhythm. The fire in our hearth seems to pulse in time with the great pendulum of the sea. The heat of the room is like the thermal consistency of the deep palace, a protective layer that keeps the winter at bay. We feel the weight of the water, the smoothness of the shells, and the steady, grinding sound of the ice floes. The sea is not a place of storms tonight. It is a place of deep, blue silence, where the logistics of the tide and the current are handled with an unhurried grace. As we drift further into the night, the image of the sorting of shells and the cleaning of the bronze veins becomes a soothing, repetitive loop in our minds. We are like a single grain of sand on the floor of Poseidon's hall, resting in the stillness, supported by the immense, quiet weight of the world. The snow continues to fall outside, a silent mimicry of the silt rain in the deep, and we are safe, warm, and profoundly bored, wrapped in the eternal, rhythmic breathing of the ancient sea. The night is long, the sea is deep, and the world is in perfect, monotonous order. The deep winter night has reached a state of absolute stillness in our sanctuary. Outside, the world has been tucked away under a layer of frost so thick that it has its own weight, pressing down on the branches of the ancient oaks until they bow in silent, frozen reverence. Inside, the fire has settled into a soft, amber glow. The logs are no longer flaming. They are breathing, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction of heat that fills the room with a sense of eternal safety. We feel the heavy, comforting presence of the stone walls, the way they hold the warmth like a treasure. In this quiet, we turn our thoughts toward the silver light that filters through the high, narrow windows, the light of the moon, and the cold, pristine logistics of the winter forest. In the Greek world, the wilderness of winter was the domain of Artemis, the goddess of the moon and the hunt. But in our story, the hunt is not an act of chase or conflict. It is a project of stewardship, a slow and methodical inventory of the natural world. We can imagine Artemis in a grove of silver birch trees, located on the high, frozen slopes of Mount Taygetus. The air here is so cold it feels brittle, like thin glass, and the moonlight turns the snow into a field of crushed diamonds. Artemis is engaged in the maintenance of her equipment, a task of profound monotony and precision. She sits on a fallen log that has been stripped of its bark by the frost, its wood as white and smooth as bone. In her lap lies her great bow, crafted not of common wood, but of polished silver and the horn of a mountain ibex. The silver is cold to the touch, and she spends hours polishing it with a piece of soft chamois leather. The sound is a rhythmic, hypnotic rub-rub-rub. She moves the leather in small, concentric circles, watching as the moonlight catches the surface and reflects back in a pale, steady beam. She is looking for the slightest imperfection, a microscopic scratch that might catch the light or disrupt the balance. When she finds one, she applies a tiny drop of almond oil, rubbing it into the silver until the metal is once again a mirror of the night sky. The scent of the oil is faint and sweet, a ghost of summer in the heart of the frozen wood. Next, she turns her attention to her arrows. She has a quiver made of white deer hide containing exactly 50 arrows. Her task is the verification of the fletching. She takes an arrow, made of seasoned ash wood, and holds it up to the moon. She examines the feathers, the primary quills of a mountain eagle. They must be perfectly aligned to ensure a silent flight. She takes a small silver comb and gently brushes the barbs of the feathers. The shur-shur-shur of the comb is a dry, delicate sound, like the rustle of dead leaves in a winter breeze. She then checks the straightness of the shaft by spinning it on the nail of her thumb. The arrow rotates with a soft, vibrating whir, a blur of ash and silver. If the vibration is uneven, she takes a small block of sandstone and lightly sands the wood, removing a fraction of a millimeter of material. She does this 50 times, once for each arrow, her movements as regular and unhurried as the turning of the stars. There is no rush. The forest is patient, and the winter night is long. While Artemis manages her tools, she is also overseeing the logistics of the hibernation. The winter forest is not empty, it is merely asleep. Artemis walks through the trees, her boots making no sound on the frozen crust of the snow. She is checking the shelter points, the hollows in the trees, the burrows beneath the roots, and the thickets of evergreen where the animals have tucked themselves away. We can imagine her kneeling by the entrance of a bear's den, hidden beneath the roots of a massive, ancient pine. She does not enter, she merely listens. She hears the slow, heavy thump-pause thump of the bear's heart, a biological clock that has slowed to its minimum frequency. She checks the depth of the snow at the entrance, ensuring that it provides enough insulation to keep the internal temperature constant, but not so much that it blocks the flow of oxygen. She uses a small wooden gauge to measure the frost line in the soil. The clink of the gauge hitting a frozen root is a sharp, lonely sound in the silence. She moves on to the stands of cedar, where the deer are huddled together for warmth. She counts them, one by one, recording the number on a tablet of carved ivory. She notes the condition of their coats, the thickness of the fat layers. She is the auditor of the wilderness, ensuring that the resources of the forest are balanced against the needs of its inhabitants. This is a task of pure logistics, a methodical accounting of life in its most dormant state. The forest smells of pine resin and cold earth, a scent that is both sharp and comforting. As the moon reaches its zenith, we turn our attention upward to the source of that silver light, the goddess Selene and the chariot of the moon. While Artemis manages the earth, Selene manages the heavens. Her journey across the sky is a masterpiece of slow-motion navigation and celestial thermal management. The chariot of the moon is not a vessel of speed, but a vessel of weight and radiance. It is made of beaten silver and translucent moonstone, which glows with an internal milky light. The chariot is pulled by two massive bulls, their hides as white as the snow on Olympus. They move with a heavy, deliberate gait, their hooves making a soft, metallic hiss as they slide through the ether of the night sky. Selene sits in the chariot, her hands resting lightly on the silver reins. Her primary concern is the regulation of the radiance. The moon does not shine with its own fire. It is a mirror, and Selene must adjust the angle of the moonstone panels to ensure that the light falling on the earth is of the correct intensity. She uses a series of silver levers, each one moving with a silent, oiled smoothness. The logistics of the moonlight are fascinating. In the winter, the light must be cool. Selene filters the light through thin sheets of mountain crystal, which remove the warmth and leave only the silver clarity. We can imagine her cleaning these crystals with a cloth of spun silk. The swish-swish of the silk against the crystal is a liquid, whispering sound. As she adjusts the panels, the light on the world below shifts. Shadows lengthen, frost crystals begin to glow, and the entire landscape takes on a three-dimensional depth that is entirely peaceful. The movement of the chariot is so slow that it is almost imperceptible. It takes 12 hours to cross the sky, a journey of absolute monotony. Selene watches the constellations pass, the Great Bear, the Hunter, the Seven Sisters. Each star is a fixed point in her logistical map. She checks her position against the silver meridian, an imaginary line etched into the fabric of the cosmos. She is the timekeeper of the night, ensuring that the dawn does not arrive a second too early or a second too late. In our own sanctuary, we feel the effects of Selene's work. The moonlight streaming through our window is steady and calming. It creates long, blue shadows on the floor, mapping the grain of the wood and the texture of the rugs. We feel the coolness of the light, a mental soothing that complements the physical warmth of the hearth. We are caught between two fires, the amber fire of the wood and the silver fire of the moon. As the night continues, Artemis returns to her grove. She has finished her inventory and her equipment maintenance. She begins the final task of the night, the sealing of the frost. She takes a small silver vial containing the essence of stillness, a liquid distilled from the first snow of the season. She walks to the edge of a frozen stream, where the water has been captured in mid-motion, forming a series of glassy ripples and frozen bubbles. She pours a single drop of the liquid onto the ice. The tink, as the drop hits the surface, is a sound of microscopic finality. From that point, a new layer of frost begins to grow, spreading outward in intricate fractal patterns. Artemis watches the growth, her eyes following the delicate white lines as they weave across the dark ice. This frost is a protective seal, a layer of insulation that prevents the deep water from freezing solid, allowing the fish and the reeds to survive in the quiet darkness below. The growth of the frost is a silent process, but if you listen very closely, you can hear a faint crackle hiss, the sound of water molecules snapping into their crystalline lattice. It is the most boring sound in the world, the sound of physical chemistry at work. Artemis stays until the entire stream is covered in a fresh, white lace. She then sits back on her log, her silver bow leaning against her shoulder, and watches the moonlight play across the new ice. In our sanctuary, we are also watching the frost. It has grown across our window panes, creating a forest of white ferns that obscures the world outside. We are sealed in our cocoon of warmth, protected by the same logistics that Artemis uses to protect the forest. We feel the weight of the silver bow, the smoothness of the ashwood arrows, and the steady, heavy pull of the moon chariot. The world of Artemis and Selene is a world of silver and white, a world where the only movement is the slow rotation of the stars and the quiet growth of the frost. There is no noise here, no urgency, only the rhythmic maintenance of the wild and the steady, predictable passage of the light. We are safe, we are warm, and we are profoundly, beautifully bored. The winter night is at its peak, and the silence is a heavy, velvet blanket that covers us completely. We close our eyes and listen to the hiss of the moon chariot and the shurr of the silver comb, drifting deeper into the dreamless sleep of the frozen wood. The forest is quiet, the moon is steady, and all is in perfect, boring order. The deep winter night has transitioned into that quiet, liminal space, the hour before the first hint of dawn. In our sanctuary, the air is perfectly still. The frost on the window panes has thickened into a dense, opaque crust, sealing us away from the world in a cocoon of absolute privacy. The fire in the hearth has reached its most efficient state. The wood is gone, replaced by a deep, glowing treasury of embers that pulse with a low, thrumming heat. This is the hour of the architect, the hour of the weaver, and the hour of the hearth keeper. As we sink deeper into the plush, heavy layers of our wool blankets, we turn our thoughts toward the quiet, logistical mastery of the Olympian household and the goddesses who manage the very fabric of existence: Hestia, Hera, and the Moirai. On Mount Olympus, the great hall is silent, illuminated only by the eternal flame of Hestia. Hestia, the eldest of the Olympians, is the goddess of the fixed point. Her existence is a study in the beauty of the stationary. While other gods may travel the earth, Hestia remains at the center, managing the logistics of the divine home. We can imagine her now, engaged in the most monotonous and essential task of all, the sifting of the ash. The central hearth is a massive structure of granite and bronze. Over the centuries, a layer of fine gray ash has accumulated beneath the glowing coals. Hestia takes a long-handled shovel made of hammered silver. The scrape slide of the silver against the granite floor is a low, earthy sound. She lifts a shovelful of ash and passes it through a fine bronze sieve. The sound is a rhythmic, dry shur-shur-shur as the dust falls through the mesh into a stone bin below. She is looking for live embers, tiny, concentrated points of heat that have fallen through the grate. When she finds one, she uses a pair of small tongs to return it to the center of the fire. This process takes hours. She moves with a deliberate, prayer-like slowness. The ash is as soft as flour, smelling of ancient oak and the memory of fire. The air around her is warm and dry, vibrating with the hum of the eternal flame. There is a profound safety in her movements. As long as Hestia sifts the ash, the center of the world remains warm and secure. On the far side of the hall, the goddess Hera, the queen of Olympus, is occupied with the inventory of the regalia. Her role is the management of the divine status and the preservation of the household's dignity. This involves the meticulous care of the sacred textiles and the golden vessels. We can imagine her in a room lined with cabinets of polished ebony, the air smelling of dried rose petals and cedar oil. Hera is currently focused on the maintenance of the sacred peplos, a massive robe woven with threads of real gold and sea silk. She lays the garment across a table of white marble. The fabric is heavy, making a soft thump-hush as it settles. She takes a small brush made of soft badger hair and begins to clean the golden embroidery. The scuff-scuff of the brush is a delicate, tactile sound. She moves from one stitch to the next, ensuring that no dust or tarnish has dulled the luster of the gold. The logistics of the peplos are immense. There are over 10,000 individual stitches, and Hera inspects each one. She uses a small magnifying glass made of polished beryl, her eyes following the intricate patterns of lilies and peacocks. When she finds a loose thread, she takes a needle of bone and a single strand of silk, tucking the thread back into place with a steady, unhurried hand. Click-pull, click-pull. The rhythm is as steady as the falling snow outside. This is the work of queenship, the quiet, boring, and essential preservation of order and beauty. While Hestia and Hera manage the home, we must look even deeper into the logistics of the universe, to the cavern of the Moirai, the three fates. They are the ultimate administrators of the Greek world, the ones who manage the logistics of time and destiny. Their workspace is a deep, limestone cave where the only sound is the whir of the great spindle and the snip of the silver shears. Clotho, the youngest, is the spinner. She sits before a pile of raw wool, the wool of the ages. This wool is neither white nor black, but a shimmering, translucent gray. She takes a handful and begins to draw it out. Her fingers move with a mechanical precision that has not varied in 1 billion years. The shirshir of the wool being pulled through her fingers is a dry, whispering sound. She attaches the end to a spindle of solid diamond. With a flick of her wrist, the spindle begins to turn. Whirr. It is a high-frequency vibration that fills the cave. The wool is transformed into a thread of life, sometimes thick and strong, sometimes thin and fragile. Clotho does not look at the thread, she feels it. She feels the tension, the texture, and the weight. Her job is the consistency of the spin. She ensures that the thread remains continuous, a single, monotonous line extending into the dark. Beside her sits Lachesis, the measurer. Her role is the logistics of length. She takes the thread from Clotho and passes it across a measuring rod made of polished obsidian. The rod is etched with marks that represent seconds, years, and eons. Lachesis uses a small silver slider to mark the length of each life. The slide click of the silver against the obsidian is a sharp, rhythmic sound. She moves the thread with a slow, steady pull. Pull, slide, click, pull, slide, click. She is the auditor of time, ensuring that every soul receives its allotted portion. She does not judge, she merely measures. The room smells of cold stone and the faint, ozone scent of the spinning diamond. There is no emotion in her work, only the mathematical certainty of the measurement. Finally, there is Atropos, the inevitable. She holds the shears of finality, a pair of small, sharp scissors made of cold-forged iron. Her task is the maintenance of the end. She waits for the signal from Lachesis. When the slider reaches the designated mark, Atropos brings the shears together. Snip. The sound is tiny, a mere click in the vast silence of the cave. The thread is cut, and the loose end is neatly tucked into a silver basket. Atropos then takes a small whetstone of emery and begins to sharpen her shears. The grind-scrape of the iron against the stone is a rhythmic, earthy sound. She must ensure the blade is always perfectly sharp, so that the cut is clean and instantaneous. This is the logistics of the end, a process that is as regular and unemotional as the rising of the tide. In our own sanctuary, we feel the resonance of the fates' work. We feel the whir of the spindle in the sound of the wind outside. We feel the slide of the measure in the way the shadows move across the floor. We are part of that thread, a long, warm, and comfortable segment of time. The fire in our hearth is Hestia's fire, and the blankets around us are Hera's textiles. We are safe within the layers of their care. The world of the Olympian household is a world of infinite detail and absolute routine. It is a world where a clean hearth, a polished robe, and a measured thread are the foundations of the cosmos. There is no room for drama in these tasks. There is only the requirement for patience and the steady application of the mind to the material. As we drift toward the final hour of the night, we imagine Hestia finishing her sifting. She banks the fire for the dawn, covering the glowing embers with a light layer of fresh ash to preserve their heat. The room grows slightly dimmer, the light turning from amber to a soft, charcoal gray. The shush of her broom as she clears the hearthstone is the final sound of the night. We feel the weight of the mountain above us, the depth of the cave below us, and the steady, boring rhythm of the universe all around us. We are tucked into the very fabric of the world, a single stitch in Hera's peplos, a single grain of ash in Hestia's hearth. The winter night is almost over, but the silence remains, a thick and comforting presence that invites us to let go of the last of our thoughts. We close our eyes and listen to the whir of the diamond spindle, drifting deeper and deeper into the velvety, dreamless peace of the ancient world. All is measured, all is stored, and all is perfectly, beautifully in its place. The final hour of the winter night has arrived. Outside our sanctuary, the darkness has begun to lose its ink-like density, turning into a deep, translucent violet. The snow has stopped falling, and a heavy, crystalline silence has settled over the Pindus Mountains. The world is frozen in a moment of absolute anticipation, held in the grip of a cold so pure it feels holy. Inside, our hearth is a landscape of soft, gray-white ash, with only a few stubborn points of crimson light pulsing deep within the mound. The warmth in the room is now a gentle, ambient presence, a memory of the fire that has sustained us through the long, character-driven journey of the night. We are wrapped in our cocoons of wool and fur, our bodies heavy with the profound boredom of a world where every logistical detail has been accounted for. We turn our final thoughts to the last stage of the cosmic cycle, the arrival of the dawn and the steady, monotonous return of the light. The transition from night to day in Greek mythology is not a sudden explosion of color, but a slow, industrial process managed by the goddess Eos. Eos, the personification of the dawn, is the ultimate logistical coordinator of the morning. Her workspace is a high, open terrace on the easternmost edge of the world, where the horizon meets the river of the sky. The air here is thin and tastes of mountain spring water and ozone. We can imagine Eos beginning her morning routine. This is not a ritual of poetry, but a task of thermal and chromatic preparation. She stands before a series of large, shallow basins carved from mother of pearl. Each basin contains a different pigment of the atmosphere. There is the pale, watery yellow of the early sun, the soft, dusty pink of the first light, and the deep, bruising purple of the retreating night. Eos takes a large sponge made of sea silk and dips it into the first basin. The squelch slosh of the liquid pigment is a wet, rhythmic sound. She begins to apply the color to the edge of the sky. This is a task of stippling. She does not paint in broad strokes. She dabs the sponge against the horizon with a steady, repetitive motion. Dab, dab, dab. Each touch of the sponge leaves a tiny, translucent layer of color that slowly blends with the darkness. She spends an entire hour on the transition from violet to indigo. It is a boring, beautiful, and painstaking process of color management. She ensures that the gradient is perfectly smooth, with no sharp lines or sudden shifts. While Eos prepares the colors, her brother Helios is engaged in the logistics of the solar chariot. The sun is not a magical ball of fire. It is a high-maintenance thermal vessel that requires daily inspection. Helios moves through the golden stables located in the shadow of the eastern peaks. The stables are filled with the scent of hot metal, dry hay, and the sharp, clean aroma of solar ether. The solar chariot is made of hammered gold and electrum, its wheels shod in tires of white-hot bronze. Helios takes a large wrench made of adamant and begins the tightening of the axles. He moves from the left wheel to the right, checking the tension of the bolts. The clink-turn-clunk of the metal is a sound of industrial stability. He then lubricates the gears using a heavy, golden oil derived from the fat of celestial cattle. The drip-slop of the oil hitting the gears is a thick, viscous sound. He is ensuring that the sun will move across the sky with a constant, unwavering velocity, exactly 15 degrees per hour. There is no room for speed. The sun must follow the prescribed track with mathematical boringness. Next comes the harnessing of the horses. These are 4 massive stallions, their coats shining with a metallic luster. They do not gallop, they march. Helios leads them out of their stalls, their hooves making a rhythmic clop, clop, clop on the golden floor. He attaches the harness, a complex system of leather straps and bronze buckles. Snap, click, pull. He does this 4 times, once for each horse, his movements as methodical as a clockmaker's. The horses breathe in a steady, synchronized rhythm, their breath forming clouds of golden mist in the cold morning air. Back on the eastern terrace, Eos is finishing the distribution of the dew. This is a task of pure logistics. She has a silver vessel shaped like a watering can, but instead of a spout, it has 1,000 tiny perforations. She walks across the sky bridge, shaking the vessel with a gentle, rhythmic motion. The sound is a soft hissure, like a gentle rain hitting a silk sheet. She is distributing the moisture that will keep the winter world from becoming too brittle. Each drop of dew is a tiny, frozen sphere that lands on the needles of the pine trees and the blades of the dormant grass. The tinkle of the dew hitting the frost is a microscopic music, a sound of the Earth's surface tension being replenished. She covers the entire world mile by mile, her footsteps making a soft swish through the ether. She does not hurry. She knows that the sun cannot rise until the dew has been properly distributed. The final moment of the cycle is the opening of the gates. At the center of the eastern horizon stand the massive gates of the sun, made of polished brass and ivory. They are operated by the Hori, the goddesses of the seasons. These gates do not swing on hinges, they slide on tracks of solid diamond. The Hori take hold of the great bronze handles. They lean their weight against the gates, and the movement begins. Insurer. The sound of the brass sliding over the diamond is a low-frequency vibration that can be felt in the very bedrock of the earth. It is a slow, heavy sound, the sound of 1,000 tons of metal moving with agonizing precision. As the gates open, the first ray of the sun, not a flare, but a thin, needle-like beam of lemon-colored light, pierces the atmosphere. It hits the dew on the Pindus Mountains, turning the white world into a field of sparkling fire. Inside our sanctuary, we see this first light. It does not wake us. It merely changes the color of the room. The gray frost on the window pane turns to a pale gold. The shadows on the floor shift their positions by a fraction of an inch. The air in the room remains warm, held in place by the thick stone walls and the memory of the hearth. We feel the click of the final logistical piece falling into place. The night has been managed, the stories have been sorted and stored, and the world has been prepared for the coming day. The Greek mythology we have explored is not a story of gods at war, but a story of gods at work. It is the story of the weaver at the loom, the blacksmith at the anvil, the ferryman at his pole, and the dawn-bringer with her sponge. It is a world of absolute order, where every snowflake is counted and every hour is measured. In this order, there is a profound and lasting peace. As the sun begins its slow, boring ascent toward the zenith, we allow ourselves to drift into the final, deepest state of rest. We feel the weight of the wool, the safety of the stone, and the rhythm of the celestial gears. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to hear but the slow, steady heartbeat of the earth as it breathes in the light. The long winter night has reached its conclusion, and we are exactly where we need to be, safe, warm, and perfectly still. The end.